There was a woman in the front row. She was pregnant. She had been on strict bed rest for weeks on doctor's orders, after having already lost 2 previous pregnancies. And yet there she was, seated in the courtroom pew, back straight, expression controlled, while her husband pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of the accident that had cost a 28-year-old woman her life. 3 days earlier, that same husband had taken her to that woman's funeral. Joan Kennedy had attended the burial of Mary Jo Kopechne, the young woman who drowned in the car Ted Kennedy was driving on the night of July 18, 1969, at the Dyke Bridge in Chappaquiddick, Massachusetts. She had stood beside her husband in the cemetery, visibly pregnant, in front of the cameras that immortalized that moment with a cruelty the journalism of the era did not recognize as such. Shortly after leaving the courtroom, Joan suffered her 3rd miscarriage. And yet she did not leave. She stayed. She remained Ted, Kennedy's wife, for 13 more years, supporting him on the campaign trail, appearing at rallies, sitting at the right tables at the right dinners, smiling in the photographs the newspapers needed. She remained exactly what the Kennedy machine had needed her to be from the day Joe Kennedy Sr., patriarch of the richest and most powerful family in 20th century American politics, insisted the wedding must go forward, even though she was not entirely certain she wanted to marry a man she barely knew. This is the story of Joan Bennett Kennedy, the woman the Kennedys chose for the showcase of their dynasty, who paid the price that showcase demands with each passing year, and who spent decades understanding that what she had lost along the way was not recoverable, but that it was also not all she had. She died on October 8, 2025, at 89 years old, in her Boston apartment, after years of dementia and a public silence so prolonged that many had forgotten she was still part of the story. She was the last survivor of the Camelot generation, the last one who had seen everything from the inside, the last one who could have told what was never told. To understand Joan Kennedy, you first have to understand what the Kennedy family was before she arrived. Not a family in the sense most people mean by that word. A financial and political institution of a sophistication that had few equivalents in the private history of America. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. had built from scratch one of the largest private fortunes of 20th century America. Born in East Boston in 1888, son of a local Irish middle-class politician who had no capital to pass on, but did have connections and community standing, Joe Kennedy started with the only asset that is not inherited but manufactured, an instinct for markets and the will to act before consensus had formed. At 25, he was already president of a Massachusetts bank. In the 1920s, he made fortunes reorganizing and refinancing Hollywood film studios. Operations his biographers describe as windfall profits, returned so far above expectations that they surprised even those who had hired him. He entered the stock market in the 1920s and exited at the precise moment he needed to exit, in 1929, before the October crash, with his investment portfolio protected, while most of the country's major investors were losing decades of accumulated capital in a matter of days. The legend holds that he knew it was time to sell when the boy who shined his shoes gave him a stock tip. When investment advice reaches the shoe-shine boy, the market is already too inflated to last. During the Great Depression, when financial collapse destroyed fortunes that had taken generations to build, Joe Kennedy grew his own, betting on real estate. He bought Manhattan properties at crisis prices and waited. In 1929, Fortune estimated his net worth at $4 million, equivalent to roughly $75 million in today's terms. By 1935, 6 years after the crash, that figure had grown to $180 million, the equivalent of more than $4 billion today. While America recovered from the worst economic crisis in its modern history, the Kennedy portfolio kept appreciating. The defining real estate move came in 1945 when he formed an investment fund to purchase the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, then the largest commercial building in the world, originally built by Marshall Field's department stores in 1930, and sold to Joe Kennedy at a price he immediately recognized as an opportunity. The building had 4 million square feet, housed hundreds of companies, and generated rental income streams that functioned exactly as his capital preservation strategy required. Real assets, stable income, management that did not demand the direct attention of heirs. That building alone was sold in 1998, 53 years after its purchase, for $625 million, a return of nearly 2,000% on the original investment. When Fortune published its first list of the wealthiest Americans in 1957, it placed Joe Kennedy in the $200 to $400 million group, equivalent to roughly $3 billion in today's terms. At his death in 1969, the most widely cited estimates place his total estate at approximately $400 million. Some later analysts, including Forbes, have calculated the updated value of his combined assets and investments at substantially higher figures, accounting for the appreciation of New York real estate in the decades that followed. But the single most important piece of the entire financial architecture Joe Kennedy constructed was not the individual assets. It was the trusts. He had established a series of them beginning in 1926, with revisions and expansions in 1936, 1949, and 1959, designed specifically to guarantee the financial independence of all his children and their descendants for several generations. The logic was explicit, and he had articulated it in conversations with several close associates. He wanted his children never to have to worry about earning money, so that they could devote themselves to politics without the constraints that economic necessity imposes on most candidates. The capital would be protected in the hands of professional managers of absolute trust. The income from the estate would be available on a regular basis. No one with the Kennedy name would ever have to work for a living, which meant all of them could afford to work for the country. That was the world into which Joan Bennett was introduced in October 1957, when Joan Kennedy Smith, her classmate at Manhattanville College, introduced her to her younger brother Ted at the dedication of the campus sports building, built in memory of Kathleen Kennedy, the sister who had died in a plane crash in France in 1948. It was the fourth Kennedy sibling to die tragically or prematurely, after Joe Jr. in World War II and before the two deaths still to come. Joan Bennett was 21 years old. She was tall, blonde, extraordinarily beautiful, with a classical piano training that distinguished her from most of the young women who circulated in the Kennedy orbit. Her father, Harry Wiggin Bennett Jr., was an advertising executive, a Cornell graduate, a member of the comfortable upper middle class of Bronxville, New York, with a respectable career and a well-ordered family. It was not a family that appeared on fortune lists. It was a comfortable, educated family. Exactly the kind of family a Kennedy of Ted's generation could present to the electorate without complications. Her mother, Virginia Joanstead Bennett, was also an alcoholic, as documented by biographer Lawrence Leamer in his work on the Kennedys. Joan grew up in a household where alcohol was a real problem that was never named, the kind of problem that upper-class families of the 1940s and 1950s managed with the same discretion with which they handled any other private shame, keeping it out of outside view while functioning internally as if it did not exist. The genetic predisposition to alcoholism Joan inherited from her parents was not known to the Kennedys until it was too late to account for it. Ted Kennedy was 25 years old. He was the youngest of Joe and Rose's 9 children, the one who arrived after the machine had already been built and only needed to be set in motion. He carried a record his biographers document without ambiguity. He had been expelled from Harvard in his first year for paying another student to take his Spanish exam, was readmitted after 2 years of honorable army service in Europe, completed his undergraduate degree with more social than academic energy, and was finishing his law degree at the University of Virginia, where he won the annual moot court competition alongside John Tunney, the future senator from California. He was the smallest name in the most powerful family in American politics, which in that context was less a defect than a promise. All of the family machinery, all of the political and financial capital that Joe Kennedy had built over 4 decades was still available to him. He had the name, the access to the funds, the access to the contacts, and the advantage of not carrying the expectations that Jack and Bobby had generated through their own trajectories. Because those expectations didn't yet exist for him. Joe Kennedy Sr. saw in Joan Bennett exactly what he needed for the last of his available sons. A white Anglo-Saxon Protestant woman, Catholic by schooling, educated in the right environments, beautiful in the way that cameras would reproduce well, with the appropriate public profile, For the political career he was already planning for Ted, with the same strategic precision he brought to managing his investment portfolio. When Joan expressed some doubts before the wedding, when she admitted she was not entirely certain she knew the man she was about to marry well enough, Joe Kennedy was direct. The wedding must proceed. It was an instruction, not a suggestion. They married on November 29th, 1958, at St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville, New York. It was a modest ceremony by Kennedy standards. A few weeks earlier, Ted's older brother, Senator John F. Kennedy, had won re-election to the Senate from Massachusetts by a margin that already clearly positioned him as a presidential candidate for 1960. Joan did not enter a family. She entered a political project valued in hundreds of millions of dollars, in motion for 30 years, with its managers in Suite 302, one of the Pan Am building in Manhattan, its trust funds distributed across real estate and fixed income vehicles, its attorneys and accountants of absolute trust, and its internal logic so precise that Joe Kennedy had been heard to say in private that it was so important for his children not to worry about money that money should not even be mentioned at the family table. There is a way of understanding the Kennedy fortune that economic history books rarely adopt, but that is necessary for comprehending what happened to Joan. Joe Kennedy's estate was not simply money. It was infrastructure, a system for generating, preserving, and transmitting capital that included not only financial assets, but also political capital, symbolic capital, and a network of relationships with power that turned every dollar invested in that last name into an asset with returns that no stock index could accurately measure. The Merchandise Mart in Chicago was only the visible part. Behind it lay decades of Manhattan real estate purchases at crisis prices, stakes in media companies, fixed income funds, and trusts designed to generate regular income for all 9 of Joe and Rose's children, without any of them ever having to make a single investment decision on their own. Professional advisors managed the capital. The heirs collected the dividends. And the heirs could thereby devote themselves to politics without the financial distractions that obstruct candidates who do not inherit a fortune of those dimensions. That is what Joan entered in 1958, a system designed to produce senators and presidents, not to protect the women who accompanied them. The system was not malicious. It was simply what it was, a machine oriented toward a specific end, and Joan was not the end, but one of the instruments on the path toward it. Joan did not know how to navigate an asset of that magnitude. No one had taught her how, and no one in the Kennedy family considered that a problem that needed to be solved before the wedding. The first years were what the Kennedys understood by normality, a version of daily life completely disconnected from that experience by any family that does not manage its wealth from an office in Manhattan. Ted completed his law degree in Virginia. They had their first child, Cara Ann, in 1960. Joan learned to be a Kennedy wife, which meant being always available, always impeccable, always ready to appear wherever a smile and the right phrase were needed for whatever journalist or photographer happened to be present. They had 3 children in total: Cara Ann in 1960, Edward Moore Kennedy Jr. in 1961, and Patrick Joseph Kennedy in 1967. Joan threw herself into motherhood with a dedication that people close to the family consistently described in warm terms. But biographers who interviewed those who knew her in that era also record something she herself would confirm with honesty years later. From the beginning, she felt out of place inside the family. Joan was shy, introverted, formed in music and literature, and the Kennedys were none of those things. They were speed, physical competition, touch football games in the yard at Hyannisport that ended with someone bleeding and that everyone described as the most fun they'd had all weekend. Biographer Adam Clymer, New York Times journalist and author of Edward M. Kennedy. A biography, expressed it with a simplicity more revealing than any elaborate analysis. Joan was shy and reserved, and the Kennedys are not. In 1962, Ted won election to the Senate from Massachusetts with the full force of the family machinery behind him. Joan appeared at rallies, sat at campaign tables, waved from campaign cars, and she discovered something about herself that for a time was her greatest contribution to the Kennedy project, and that would later become a part of the story no one found comfortable to remember. At the piano, in front of an audience, opening campaign events with classical pieces, Joan Bennett Kennedy was extraordinarily good. Not merely competent, good. Audiences stopped, people paid attention. In a world of speeches and banners and handshakes, Joan seated at the piano was different from everything else, and that difference generated a type of emotional connection with voters that no campaign advisor could have manufactured. They arrived in Washington in 1963. Joan was 27, and the wife of the youngest senator in the United States Congress. Fashion magazines interviewed her. Newspapers photographed her. She was blonde, elegant, with a natural grace that required no visible effort, and a real musical talent that gave her depth in a world of surfaces. Everything was in its place. Then, November 1963 arrived, and Joan Kennedy's world began to break at its edges in a way that would never fully mend. The assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, did not only destroy the Kennedy family in the most obvious emotional sense, it also destroyed the architecture of security that Joan had learned to inhabit. Jack was the master plan, the center of the entire political project toward which Joe Kennedy had directed decades of investment in social, financial, and political capital. With Jack dead, Ted moved from promising younger brother to next in line. The pressure on him, on his career, on his public image, and on everything surrounding that image, including his marriage and the woman who gave that marriage its public face, multiplied instantly and permanently. 6 months after the assassination, in June 1964, Ted Kennedy survived a plane crash when the small aircraft in which he was traveling went down near Springfield, Massachusetts. 2 people were killed. Ted survived with severe back fractures that kept him hospitalized and in a rehabilitation facility for months, unable to move. Joan, with 4 years of marriage and 2 small children, became his de facto political representative during the 1964 Senate re-election campaign. She traveled across Massachusetts, gave speeches, shook hands, answered journalists' questions about the policies of a man who had been named senator 2 years earlier. Ted won re-election from a hospital bed. Joan made it possible. That is what the Kennedys never processed as a debt. That, every time the family needed Joan to hold up something that was falling, Joan was there. Not once, but every time. And each time the cost was higher and the recognition was less. In 1968, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in Los Angeles, while he was celebrating his California presidential primary victory, completed the transformation of Kennedy family life into something that their own mother, Rose Kennedy, described in her diary as impossible to believe, even for someone who had already lived through it before. 2 sons assassinated in 5 years, 2 presidencies interrupted or cancelled, a dynasty that had built one of the greatest fortunes in America and the greatest political brand in the country in the 20th century, paying for it in lives. For Joan, the effects were quieter and deeper than anyone documented at the time. Ted began wearing a bulletproof vest at his public appearances because the fear of political violence was now concrete, physical, with precedent in his own family. And Ted, according to his own testimony, recorded in the interviews he gave to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia in 2006, began to drink more and to be less present in the marriage in ways that went considerably further than the physical absences that Senate politics already imposed as a matter of course. In those same Miller Center statements, Ted Kennedy recalled first noticing Joan's alcohol problem in 1962 during his Senate campaign. "I walked into the room and saw her unsteady," he said. He remembered it as something strange, isolated, inexplicable at the time. What he did not say in that interview, and what biographers have documented in detail from multiple testimonies, is that the unsteadiness he was observing was in part a direct result of what was occurring inside the marriage. Ted Kennedy's infidelities, which journalists who covered the senator knew about and did not report, because the unwritten rules of American political journalism of the era protected the private lives of legislators with a generosity that decades later would prove difficult to justify, were known within the family's immediate circle, with sufficient detail that sustained denial carried a structural cost for anyone who attempted it. What Joan lived through in the 1960s, the years of Ted's rise, the assassinations, the rallies, the bulletproof vest, the plane crash, the alcohol, did not occur in abstraction. It occurred in the context of a family where money was never a concern, where access was never a problem, where estate managers and communications advisors and trusted attorneys were always available to resolve any problem that money could resolve, and where the problems money could not resolve were managed with the same discretion applied to the portfolio's less profitable assets, keeping them out of outside view and waiting for them to stop being a visible problem. Joan's alcoholism was managed this way for years, not with active cruelty, but with the efficient indifference of a system that had no design function for that kind of problem. The trust funds kept generating their dividends, the advisors kept managing the portfolio, the journalists kept not reporting on what was happening inside senators' marriages, and Joan kept drinking, and every time the problem became visible, the machine activated its damage control mechanisms without asking what had produced the damage in the first place. Joan explained it with disarming clarity in the interview she gave People magazine in August 1978, the first time she spoke publicly about her alcoholism by name and without euphemism. The rumors about Ted, she said, had driven her to drink, though she had never believed them. The internal logic of that sentence only works if you understand that Joan knew perfectly well the difference between believing something and acknowledging that you believed it. The denial was not passivity. It was the only strategy available to someone inside that marriage who wanted to remain inside that marriage. Then July 1969 arrived. On July 18th, 1969, Ted Kennedy arrived at Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard to participate in the annual Edgartown Yacht Club regatta. That evening, he attended a dinner at a rented cottage on the small island of Chappaquiddick, accessible from Edgartown by ferry. The dinner was a gathering of the so-called boiler room girls, the young female staffers, all in their 20s, who had worked on Robert Kennedy's 1968 presidential campaign. There were 6 women. There were also 6 men, all married. The wives had not been invited for the weekend. Joan was not there. She had been on bed rest for weeks due to 2 prior miscarriages and was pregnant again. According to the statement Kennedy himself gave to the authorities and repeated in a nationally televised address days later, at some point between 11 in the evening and midnight, he left the party with Mary Jo Kopechne, 28 years old, a former Bobby campaign staffer, claiming he intended to drive her to the ferry so she could return to her hotel in Edgartown. On the way, he took a turn onto a dirt road that did not lead to the ferry, but to a small single-lane wooden bridge with no guardrails over Poocha Pond. The 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont he was driving went off the bridge and landed upside down in the water. Kennedy managed to get out of the vehicle. Mary Jo Kopechne did not. Kennedy did not call the authorities that night, not at 11, not at midnight, not at 2 in the morning. He swam back to Edgartown, contacted his cousin Joseph Gargan and attorney Paul Markham, returned to his hotel, and did not report the accident to local police until the following morning at 9:45, 1 hour after divers responding to a separate report had found Mary Jo Kopechne's body inside the submerged car. The nearly 10-hour interval between the accident and the notification of authorities became the center of one of the most prolonged debates in American political history. Kennedy never gave an explanation that satisfied investigators, journalists, or biographers. The inquest judge who presided over the January 1970 inquiry concluded that Kennedy had driven negligently, if not recklessly, and that the vehicle turned onto the road toward the bridge intentionally, not accidentally. No charges were recommended. A grand jury, subsequently convened, also issued no formal indictments. Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of the accident and received a suspended 2-month sentence. In a live televised address, broadcast by all 3 major networks, he denied having driven under the influence of alcohol and denied having had a personal relationship with Kopechne. Joan Kennedy was 32 years old. She was pregnant. She had been on bed rest for weeks due to 2 previous miscarriages, and yet she was in the courtroom when her husband pleaded guilty. She attended Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral. When journalists approached, she said it had been a tragic and deeply unfortunate accident, and that she believed everything Ted had said. Shortly afterward, she lost the third pregnancy. She herself attributed the miscarriage to the emotional impact of the weeks surrounding Chappaquiddick. That accumulation of blows, each one built upon the previous ones, with no time to process any before the next arrived, is what makes Joan Kennedy's story different from any other story about a marriage in difficulty. It was not an episode. It was a continuous process that lasted years, operating simultaneously at multiple levels. The public level, where Joan had to maintain the appearance of normality that the Kennedy machine required. The private level, where Ted's infidelities, the alcoholism growing inside her, and the traumas arriving one after another without any interval for recovery, accumulated with no visible exit. And the institutional level, where the family and its estate managers and its communications advisors and its political network functioned with the efficiency of a well-capitalized corporation to protect the asset called Ted Kennedy, without anyone on the team having the specific function of also protecting the woman called Joan. In 1973, another crisis arrived. Her son, Teddy Jr., 12 years old, was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, a bone cancer in his right leg. Doctors recommended amputation. The lower portion of the right leg was surgically removed. 2 years of chemotherapy followed, which Teddy Jr. himself described decades later in interviews with a frankness his parents had never shown about that period. Painful, terrifying, with moments in which the probability of survival was not what any parent wants to hear. The treatment worked. Teddy Jr. survived, studied law at Yale and the University of Connecticut, became an attorney specializing in disability rights law, and years later became his own mother's legal guardian when Joan could no longer care for herself. While the older son was fighting cancer, the younger son, Patrick, was suffering severe asthma attacks, requiring constant medical attention. Joan moved between hospitals and campaign appearances and public obligations and the alcohol, which by then was no longer an occasional resource for managing anxiety, but a physical necessity with its own rules and its own destructive logic. In 1974, the situation became public in the most brutal way possible. Joan Bennett Kennedy was arrested for driving under the influence. The news occupied simultaneously the society columns and the political pages. She was 38 years old. She was the wife of Senator Kennedy, sister-in-law of the assassinated president, part of the symbolic patrimony of the most photographed family in American politics. And the police had stopped her in the street. Shortly afterward, Joan spent 3 weeks at Silver Hill Foundation, a private detoxification center in Connecticut. Joan's mother, when asked by journalists about her daughter's admission, said something that perfectly summarizes the abyss between the real experience and the language with which families of a certain social level described that experience in the 1970s. When you need to rest, where do you go? Her mother described it as a rest vacation. Joan called it by its name on the cover of People. In August 1978, Joan gave that magazine the most important interview of her life. She was 42 years old. She had spent a year living apart from Ted in a Boston apartment, was enrolled in a graduate education program at Lesley College in Cambridge, was attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and was seeing a psychiatrist regularly. And she talked. She said she needed her own space and time to understand what her needs were, now and for the rest of her life. She said she had had to suffer a great deal and cause a great deal of suffering to her family and friends in order to face herself. And she said that the rumors about Ted's infidelities had driven her to drink, though she had never believed them. That last sentence is the most important thing Joan Kennedy said in public in 40 years, not because it reveals something not already known, but because it reveals exactly how much it cost to maintain the architecture of denial that the Kennedy marriage required of her, and how much she had needed to drink in order to keep from having to stop maintaining it. The separation of 1977 was real, though never formally announced. Joan moved to Boston. Ted remained at the Virginia residence. The children were distributed between the two. For the first time in nearly 20 years of marriage, Joan built something entirely her own: a routine, an apartment, an academic program, a therapy, a life that did not depend on anyone else's schedule. And then, in 1979, Ted Kennedy decided to run, in the 1980 Democratic primaries, against incumbent President Jimmy Carter. It was the biggest gamble of his political career. The attempt to reclaim for the Kennedy family the executive power that Jack's assassination had interrupted in 1963, that Bobby's candidacy had tried to restore in 1968 before being eliminated in Los Angeles, that the ghost of Chappaquiddick had blocked in 1972 and again in 1976. And any Ted Kennedy presidential campaign required a credible answer to the most obvious question any journalist could ask at any rally. If a man abandons a woman drowning in his car and waits 10 hours before calling the police, what kind of president would that man be in a national crisis? The answer the Kennedy campaign constructed for that question included Joan. She came back. She moved in with Ted again. She appeared at campaign events. Journalists who covered that campaign and have written about it in the years and decades since consistently described Joan in that period as surprisingly lucid, articulate, and engaged. She gave interviews. She explained why she believed in her husband. She did exactly what she had known how to do since 1962, convince the public that the Kennedy marriage was what it appeared to be from the outside. Ted lost the primaries to Jimmy Carter. Carter lost the general election to Ronald Reagan in November 1980. The project of restoring Camelot from the Oval Office ended definitively with the most unfavorable electoral map the Democratic Party had seen in decades, and Joan returned to her Boston apartment. This time, there was no reunification left to sustain. In 1981, the Kennedys officially announced plans to divorce. The divorce was finalized in 1982, and the documents were signed in 1983. Joan received in the settlement the house at Squaw Island on Cape Cod, 2 wooden row houses that Joan's grandfather had purchased in 1901, 30 years before the Kennedys arrived at Hyannisport, which made this property something curious in patrimonial terms. It was the only piece of real estate in the divorce settlement that had originally belonged to Joan's family and not to Ted's. She also received an alimony payment that guaranteed her basic financial independence, sufficient to live without working, but without the scale that the Kennedy trust funds assured their direct beneficiaries. Ted, whose personal wealth was tied to the family trust funds managed by the advisors Joe Kennedy had appointed decades earlier, remained one of the 40 millionaires in the United States Senate, with a declared net worth in his financial disclosure reports in excess of $9.9 million. Ted remarried in 1992. Victoria Reggie, a Washington attorney from a Southern family with its own ties to the Democratic power circle. Victoria remained by Ted's side until his death in 2009, when a brain tumor diagnosed in 2008 ended his life at Hyannisport at the age of 77. Joan never remarried. According to people close to her, she did not seek another romantic relationship after the divorce. She spent the first half of the 1980s completing the education master's degree she had begun during the separation, which she received from Lesley College in 1982. She began giving lectures on classical music in schools and colleges, combining her training as a pianist with a message about the power of the arts in education that resonated genuinely because it was genuine. It was not Mrs. Kennedy giving a lecture. It was Joan Bennett, who had studied piano since childhood, talking about what she knew. She published a book in 1992 titled The Joy of Classical Music, a guide for you and your family that reflected decades of training and teaching. She traveled as a solo pianist, accompanying orchestras in various American cities. She was, for the first time in more than 30 years, the active subject of her own life. There is another angle of Joan Kennedy's story that the obituaries published in October 2025 treated with brevity. What she did after the divorce, the life she built when she no longer had to build it for anyone else. Because Joan Kennedy, between 1982 and the years when dementia began to make independent living impossible, was not simply a figure from the past, surviving at the margins of her ex-husband's history. She was someone who recovered, with effort, without guarantees, with relapses that form part of the honest account, something that resembled the person she might have been if she had had the opportunity to choose her own terms from the beginning. The alcoholism had not ended. It never truly had. The cycle of relapses continued for the following decades, with a regularity that eventually became publicly known medical history. multiple arrests for driving under the influence across the 1990s and early 2000s, stays in rehabilitation centers, some voluntary, others court-ordered as conditions of release, periods of sobriety, some prolonged, followed by new relapses. In July 2004, her son Teddy Jr., who had survived cancer at 12 and had become a disability rights attorney in Connecticut, obtained legal guardianship over his mother to ensure her medical and financial care. In 2005, her children received a temporary guardianship order from a Massachusetts court. That same year, Joan established a trust to control the management of her assets, with her second cousin, Webster E. Jansen, a Connecticut financial planner, as trust administrator. The woman who had entered in 1958 the family that had built the most sophisticated private trust fund system in American political history now needed her own trust, administered by a distant cousin in Connecticut, to protect what remained of her divorce alimony and the value of the Squaw Island property. And in October 2005, on a rainy night in Boston, a passerby found an elderly woman lying on the wet pavement of a Beacon Hill street, bleeding and disoriented. He called an ambulance. The woman was hospitalized with a concussion and a broken shoulder following a fall. The person who called the ambulance told Boston Magazine afterward that he had no idea who she was, that he didn't know she was anyone special. It was Joan Bennett Kennedy. She was 69 years old. She was the last Kennedy of Camelot, the woman who had sat in the courtroom pew in Edgartown in July 1969, who had attended Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral while pregnant and had lost the pregnancy shortly afterward, who had smiled in thousands of campaign photographs over 24 years, who had opened rallies at the piano, who had watched two brothers-in-law be assassinated, who had watched her son lose a leg at 12 years old, who had earned a graduate degree at 46 years old after the divorce, who had written a book about classical music, who had played piano in theaters across the country, who had learned and forgotten and learned again how to stay sober. Nobody recognized her. The last 20 years of Joan Kennedy's life was silent, in a way that historians and biographers who deal with the family have not yet fully processed. She attended Ted's funeral in August 2009, seated in the church at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, with her back straight and her expression controlled, as she had always learned to do. Someone photographed her. The images circulated briefly. She was a small elderly woman with white hair, recognizable only to those who had followed the complete story. Nobody wrote much about her presence there. Her daughter Cara died on September 16, 2011, of a heart attack while exercising at a Washington, D.C. gym. She was 51 years old. She had survived a lung cancer diagnosis in 2002, completed treatment, and been pronounced clear by her doctors. She died suddenly, in a way no one anticipated and for which no one was prepared. Joan lost her only daughter with 57 fewer years than Joan herself would ultimately live. The dementia arrived in the final years. The progression was gradual and quiet, as the last 2 decades of her life had been quiet. On October 8, 2025, Joan Bennett Kennedy died in her Boston apartment in her sleep. She was 89 years old. Her death certificate lists the cause as dementia. Her sons Ted Jr. and Patrick issued a brief statement. The major outlets published obituaries that mentioned Camelot and the alcoholism and the piano at the rallies and Chappaquiddick. She was the last of her generation, they wrote, and her passing closed a chapter. But no chapter closes as easily as obituaries suggest. It is worth pausing on what it means, in concrete human terms, what Joan Bennett did in the weeks surrounding Chappaquiddick. Not as a declaration of loyalty or a political calculation, but as the act of a real person who was pregnant and had already lost 2 pregnancies, and who went to the funeral of the woman who died in her husband's car, and then sat in the courtroom, and then went home and lost the 3rd pregnancy. The physical cost of those weeks, measured in terms of what happened to her body, is already sufficiently revealing. The psychological cost, which only began to become visible in the years that followed through the alcoholism and the recurring crises, was never systematically measured by anyone, because no one in the Kennedy structure had that function. The Kennedys had attorneys to manage the legal exposure from Chappaquiddick. They had communications advisors to manage the public narrative. They had contacts in the Massachusetts state government to manage the judicial process in a way that minimized political damage. The book, Senatorial Privilege, The Chappaquiddick Cover-Up, published by Leo D'Amour in 1988, documented in detail how the Kennedy machine activated in the hours and days following the accident to construct a version of events that would protect Ted from the most serious consequences. D'Amour, who had interviewed dozens of people with direct knowledge of the events, described that process as the systematic use of the family's political and financial capital to neutralize a situation that any citizen without those resources would have faced with incomparably more severe consequences. Joan had none of those mechanisms available to manage what was happening to her. There was no team of lawyers for Joan's miscarriage. There were no communications advisors for Joan's alcoholism. There were no contacts in the relevant institutions to manage the psychological cost of having stood beside her husband at Mary Jo Kopechny's funeral while pregnant. There was a family that needed Joan to remain presentable, and Joan who tried, and the alcohol that kept filling the space between what they needed and what she could give. Senator Kennedy recovered politically from Chappaquiddick in a way his biographers describe as remarkable. He was re-elected to the Senate in 1970, 1976, 1982, 1988, 1994, 2000, 2006, and the 2008 special election that was the last before his death in 2009. For 4 decades, he was one of the most influential legislators in the United States Congress, author or co-author of legislation on civil rights, access to education, health regulation, and worker protection that transformed fundamental aspects of the lives of tens of millions of Americans. The press called him the Lion of the Senate. It was a nickname he accepted, and that the political history of the late 20th century justifies in many respects. Joan Kennedy, across those same 4 decades, was arrested for drunk driving, checked into rehabilitation centers, lost guardianship of her own life when her children had to manage it legally, was found on a Boston sidewalk without anyone recognizing her, and died of dementia at 89 years old. Those 2 stories occurred in parallel. They are not independent. They are the 2 sides of what it cost to build and sustain, for 24 years, what the world saw as the Kennedy marriage. The story of Joan Kennedy is the story of someone who was incorporated into a structure of power and capital with the logic by which an asset is added to an investment portfolio, for its immediate value and for what that value could do in terms of long-term political return. The Kennedy estate, built by Joe Sr. from nothing over 4 decades, managed from Manhattan by advisors who understood trust funds and real estate portfolios and asset management as rigorous disciplines, had also produced a logic of control over the people inside the family that functioned with the same efficiency as the logic of control over financial assets. People inside the Kennedy system had a value defined by their contribution to the family project. Jack was the central asset, the destination of all the capital accumulated over decades. Bobby was the operational manager, the one who executed what Jack decided. Ted was the heir to continuity, the one who would keep the brand alive after the others could no longer do so. And Joan was the complement that the asset called Ted Kennedy needed in order to function in the American electoral market. The impeccable wife, the present mother, the figure who guaranteed that the Kennedy product included what the American electorate of the 1960s and 1970s wanted to see when it looked at a candidate. The problem with that kind of architecture, in investment portfolios and in families that function as if they were investment portfolios, is that it includes no mechanisms for protecting the components that deteriorate. Assets that decline in value are liquidated or managed to minimize losses. They are not protected. Joan began to deteriorate, in terms of her utility to the Kennedy project, from 1962 onward, when the alcoholism first became visible. She continued to deteriorate with every arrest, every rehabilitation admission, every public appearance that required crisis management rather than image management. And the machine that had incorporated her into the system had no mechanism designed to return to her what it had cost to be inside that system. That is not an accusation. It is a description of how structures of power function when capital, in all its forms, is the organizing principle. Joe Kennedy built an extraordinary fortune and a political legacy without equivalent in 20th century American history. He did both with an intelligence and a determination that his biographers, even the most critical, acknowledge without reservation. But the logic by which he built both was the logic of someone who understands that resources are instruments for an end, and that instruments are evaluated by their utility to the end and not by their intrinsic value. Joan Bennett was not an instrument. She was a woman with her own childhood, with a real musical talent, with a capacity for love toward her children that people who knew her in her most private moments describe as genuine and intense, with a vulnerability to alcoholism that came from her own family history before she had ever met a Kennedy, and with a resilience that led her, at 42 years old, to speak on the cover of an American magazine with more honesty about her own life than any Kennedy had spoken about theirs up to that point. That this resilience arrived late, that the years of accumulated damage left a mark that was never fully erased, that the price she paid for belonging to that family was higher than any financial benefit the marriage brought her. These are facts that history records without the Kennedy family ever having acknowledged them directly. What history also records is that Joan Kennedy, despite everything it cost her, never entirely relinquished the people she loved inside the name she carried for 24 years. She was at Ted's funeral. She maintained her relationship with her children until the end. She did not convert her story into resentment or a memoir or a public statement of unsettled accounts. That, too, is a form of strength. Not the kind the world usually celebrates, but perhaps the most costly of all. There is one scene from Joan Kennedy's story that deserves more space than it typically receives in the chronicles of that period. When Ted Kennedy announced in 1979 his candidacy for the 1980 Democratic primaries, one of the first major public appearances of the campaign was the interview he gave to Roger Mudd for CBS. It was a strategically important interview because the Kennedy team knew that Mudd would ask about Chappaquiddick, and they wanted Ted's answer to set the tone for the rest of the campaign. Ted gave the interview, and when Mudd asked him directly why he wanted to be president, the most recognizable senator in America could not give a coherent answer. He got lost in generalities. He contradicted himself. He appeared surprised by a question for which he should have had a rehearsed response for months. The interview was a public relations disaster that damaged the campaign before it truly began. Political analysts pointed to it as an example of what happens when a candidate builds a candidacy on the accumulated capital of a family brand rather than on a vision of his own. The Kennedy name, with all the emotional weight of JFK and Bobby and Camelot, could fill venues and generate donations and mobilize volunteers. But when Roger Mudd asked what Ted wanted to do with all that capital, Ted Kennedy had no prepared answer. Joan appeared at rallies of that campaign with the same quiet competence as always. She smiled. She answered questions. She was exactly what the campaign needed her to be. And when the campaign ended, when Carter won the primaries and Reagan won the election and the project of restoring Camelot from the Oval Office was definitively archived, Joan returned to Boston without fanfare and without recognition and began building the life described above. There is something in that contrast that summarizes the entire story. Ted Kennedy, who could not answer the most basic question a presidential candidate can receive, was remembered as the lion of the Senate. Joan Kennedy, who knew how to answer every question she was asked over 24 years, without anyone having given her the answers in advance, was remembered primarily for her alcoholism. That asymmetry in how history distributes its labels is not an accident. It is a feature of the system both of them inhabited, with very different consequences for each. One final reflection on capital and its forms. Joe Kennedy Sr. built his fortune through a combination of intelligence, opportunism, and a willingness to operate in grey zones that his biographers document with varying degrees of candor. But that the final result converts into a philosophical question before a moral judgment. What is a $400 million fortune worth, equivalent to several billion in today's terms, when the human cost of maintaining the surname that manages it includes the story of Joan Kennedy? How is that cost accounted for in the balance sheet of a family estate? What column does it occupy in the portfolio of the most photographed family in 20th century American politics? Those questions have no answers that any trust fund manager can provide, but they are the questions that Joan Kennedy's story leaves open when the last chapter of the last obituary is closed. The money kept working after Joan left. The trust funds kept generating their dividends. The real estate assets kept appreciating. The Kennedy name kept being a brand with real political value decades after Camelot. And Joan Bennett, who had entered that machine at 22 without fully understanding what she was signing, came out of it 47 years later with The House at Squaw Island, a divorce alimony, a book about classical music, and the dignity of having spoken aloud about what all of it had cost her, long before it was comfortable to do so. And it is worth remembering too, because history tends to forget it when the ending is sad, that Joan Kennedy survived almost everything that was thrown at her. She survived the miscarriages, and the plane crash, and Chappaquiddick, and the arrests, and the people cover, and the divorce, and her son's cancer, and the death of her daughter, and decades of chronic alcoholism. She died of dementia at 89 years old, in her own apartment, in peace, surrounded by people who loved her. That this is not enough, for those who expect stories of complete redemption, says more about what we expect of people than about what Joan Kennedy achieved or failed to achieve. Ted Kennedy donated his entire Senate salary, $100,000 annually, to charity during his first years in office, following the example of his brother JFK. It was a gesture the press covered favorably, and that formed part of the public image of a family that served the country before its own economic interests. Joan, whose contribution to Ted Kennedy's public image over 24 years has no possible salary equivalent, received no comparable public recognition for what she contributed. That is how capital works when someone's contribution has no contract. If this story has stayed with you, if at any point you found yourself thinking about what it means to enter a family that manages its wealth and power with corporate efficiency without anyone explaining the rules before you sign, leave your thoughts in the comments. There are many ways to read the story of Joan Kennedy. We want to know yours. And if you want to learn more about the women who lived inside the great American fortunes of the 20th century and paid the price those fortunes charge to those who inhabit them without controlling them, this channel has the story of Babe Paley, of the Ford sisters, of the Onassis heiresses, the empires built with capital and sustained with silence. Subscribe. The next story is already on its way.